So without further ado, welcome, Roderick.
Thank you so much, Connie, for the very kind introduction, and to the Haven Center for having me here. Tatiana, Richard, Patrick, all of you have been very accommodating and helpful in making this all possible. And thanks, of course, for all of you coming today. So, this is what we call as a sort of follower to one degree or another of Paulo Freire. We call the tyranny of the podium, where I stand all before you. You all are in something of a circle, but not facing each other so much as facing me, which is much of, is one of the main things that Freire criticized about education. But now you see the power of the institution to define the circumstances under which we do business. So I'm going to try to create a few twists and turns in this presentation, so it's not so much that I am loading you up like piggy banks with all my grand and great knowledge, but there's something that we can both talk about, some object to mediate our dialogue, as Freire would like that to be. So, the title, Sociopolitical Development, is not just for activists anymore. So many of my colleagues are coming up with clever titles, and I'm kind of working on rather the old state stuff, see if I can kind of get in the swing of things here. But what I'm trying to say is that the study that they kind of referred to is an international study of youth organizing and civic development in young people. We're trying to sort of convince people that are interested in youth development that political work by youth produces many of the same kinds of positive developmental outcomes as work that's done without any kind of political emphasis in it. Emphasis on healthy development and sense of belonging and all those sort of things. We believe a lot of that can happen while young people are involved in political work, social change work. And we think about marginalized youth, issues around sex, race, culture, sexual orientation, and the like. A lot of these young people, it makes sense to them, given their life experience, to not only work on themselves, but to work on society. So it's not just for activists, it's all for all young people. Indeed, for us older folks as well, because by the looks of things, none of you are still in your teenage years. Am I correct on that? So I think it's something that adults can benefit from as well. Now, the clicker, do I take the button at 12 o'clock or what was it? Yes, okay, right. So I'm going to talk about some work I did in the 90s and on up to a manuscript I'm working on now. And some of the, as Kai said, the principal interest I have is in social political development theory, trying to understand what it takes for people to get engaged and involved in social justice work. I've been interested in liberation psychology for a while, but one of the reasons I'm delighted to speak here is that when you start talking about liberation, it's not a set of issues that is connected to any one discipline. It's an issue that involves a variety of disciplines. And I'm trying to break out of my conceptual incarceration that my training in both clinical and community psychology has placed me in, and to learn from my colleagues such as you. So I'm going to leave at least 30 minutes for discussion in my presentation. Some of the key words that I think about: oppression, liberation, critical consciousness, which brings a lot of these ideas together, which can be unpacked a little bit to consider a part that's reflection, which I'll talk about as critical social analysis. Agency, that get up and go, that makes you get up and do. Activism, and I'm also including civic engagement, because often when I give talks, people think I poo-poo civic engagement. It's not something that's important. I have a particular interest in political work and social justice work, but civic engagement and maintaining communities around social, cultural, and other sort of issues are essential for a society. So I'm interested in how that plays out as well, but I think much less work has been done on the political side of things, especially in the U.S. Identity, social identities will also be something I'll talk about quite a bit today in my work in that. And tomorrow I'll be talking more about issues of well-being, but I won't get much into that today, but at least this provides a little context. So, the data I'm going to use comes from a organization called Center for Third World Organizing in Oakland, California, and this is a group of them in front of a huge mansion they recently sold for a tidy sum. And the folks who had gone through their training program, which is a movement activist apprenticeship program, where young people, not necessarily young, but typically in their 20s, early 30s, apply to get training as community organizers. And so most of the data I'll be talking about will be from that study. And this is the two major parts of the larger theory I've been working on for a number of years now. And I call it kind of my Starbucks theory, because in Starbucks I often sitting around with colleagues and we talk and wax very eloquently about our social analysis, why the world is, why there's all the degree of inequality we see. But that doesn't mean any of us are actually going to get up and do anything about it. But we do have a very eloquent analysis of it. So we kind of like what we call sort of armchair activism, where you got it all in your head. But my question was always what's the difference between those who have an analysis and act, and those who have an analysis and don't act? Then there are those who have neither analysis or action, in no case. But you also have people who act with no analysis, and we call that a right. So we want people who thoughtfully, strategically think in the long term around political action so that long-term benefits can occur. So a couple of things to think about here. One is the political side, the civic side, what I mentioned, commitment to do it, and distinguish from behavior. And I make that distinction because you can want to do something, but you have to have some opportunity to do it. So opportunity structures, often in formal organizations, have to give you the opportunity. And also you have to believe that you, working collectively with others, can make something happen. So your analysis can be transformed into some change in the social and political environment. And then there are various things that feed into that. And most of my early work has been interviewing sort of avowed activists who have a reputation for being activists about their early upbringing, and also trying to understand the organizations and roles they played in their work. Because I have an interest in organization development, understanding how we can create organizations and do organization development, capacity building, so that we create organizations that can help folks to develop this analysis in the upper left. To some extent, I'm interested in seeing if there's a meaningful distinction on the ground by people who are actually doing the work between the political and social justice activism and civic work. So some of the work I've been doing, survey work I've been doing, is trying to see if I can distinguish those two as different from one another. So that's the basic theory I've been working on, but there's some pieces that you don't see in that model until I put up this last piece, which is where does social identity fit in? Is that like an outcome, which is kind of how I see this? Or is it more of something that's going to predict this? I mean, is it something you're trying to get to? Is it something you need before you get to where you want to get to? Just how to think about that, I'm still sort of looking at. I'll give you some of my early insights as we go on in that. But let me first have a volunteer. This is the fun part, okay? And the reason I want to do this is because people often tell me I work with young people, all these highfalutin ideas about oppression and all this stuff, that how can you expect young kids to understand this stuff? So can I have two volunteers come to the front? I'm not going to hypnotize you or get you embarrassed in any way. So just come to the front. Remember, Fieri would not allow me. I mean, he's over my shoulder now. He's already going tisk tisk. So I need to, there we go.
Okay.
Thank you very much, sir. Your name?
Bob.
Bob, thank you, Bob. Could I have one more volunteer? This is what we call activism. You don't just sit. You act. Okay? Come on now.
Yeah.
There we go. See, she knows you got to walk the walk rather than just talk the talk. Isn't that right? So I want you both to pretend that you are 3, 4 years old. Okay? All right, so come over here to the front. I'm going to give you each a task. And I want you, sir, to draw a circle on this piece of paper. Okay? That's all, just circles. Best of circle as you can manage. and you to make a square, about the same size as his. Okay, we'll show the audience what you came up with. Now imagine, again, you're maybe 4 years old or so. Did you see these? Okay.
Brilliant drawings.
Okay. Now, as a reward, we're going to give you this. Okay? And for your reward, you're going to get this. So now, if you were 4 or 5 years old and you had taken the task and look at what you did, and you saw what you got and you saw what she got, what would you think you would say?
I would think that you value squares more than circles.
Oh, okay. That's one interpretation, right? If you're and you're a 4, what might you think?
Well, I would think, how come I got more than he did? That's not right.
And you know what kids often say when you do something like this? That's not right. Or that's not fair. Often that's not fair. Very young children will say this. But what's interesting, he parsed it a little bit, though he said, and that's why I didn't have them both draw circles, because this is more a little bit thinking about equity than equality. But they both did pretty good drawings, though, didn't they? Of what they were asked to do. It's not really clear that you did that much better with your square than he did. Yet, I didn't give equal pay, equal work to them. Right? So, with that, I'll pass these around. Because it would be inequitable to do otherwise. And be aware of the people who are following you, so you don't take too big. See, most of what you learn is the value you learn in kindergarten anyway, right? Which is you got to think about other people who are going around the table. But my point here is that, and you see this little dog here, and they seem to be fighting, perhaps over that, or some kind of animal anyway. But the point here is, it's a very simple principle I'm going to use in thinking about the issue of oppression. One is what, when we get in university, we talk about it as things like distributive justice, for example. But it's really a fundamentally simple idea, and I got to keep from going on too long, but it's interesting they've done some animal studies with chimps that suggest that this actually may be wired into us. And the fact that children, before they get formal operations and all that stuff, utter it. And it's often emotional too, isn't it? That's not fair. It's not just, that's not fair. So what's the emotion in that? So this is not purely an intellectual exercise for, I think, as social beings, but there are things going on too. So I'm going to give a simple definition of oppression to start with. Think about it as a process, the unjust exercise of power by one group over the other. Another in a way that establishes and maintains social inequity and privilege. And a second piece, not just structures that create the situation and maintain it, but also the consequences of long-term deprivation and inequity. And in my profession, psychology, clinical psychology, we spend a lot more time on this and very little time on this, right? And what it says below there is typically there's some sort of ideology of superiority used as a rationale for establishing this inequity, so it doesn't seem like it's wrong in some way, or it's wrong. Any of these sort of class, sexual orientation, those sorts of things. And when I talk about critical social analysis, is trying to go from first recognizing something's unequal or inequitable, and then trying to determine whether or not it constitutes an unfair or unjust inequity. So you need to know kind of what you're talking about before you can really start that social analysis. And so this is the best definition I have it in almost all my presentations of critical socialization, critical conscious rather. Learn to think critically about accepted ways of thinking and feeling, discerning the hidden interest in underlying assumptions and framing notions, whether they be class, gender, race, ethnicity, or sex-based, It means learning to see in the mundane particulars of ordinary lives how history works, how received ways of thinking and feeling serve to perpetuate existing structures of inequality. And special bonus points, an extra handful of goodies if anybody knows who said that. Gramsci. So this, he didn't call it critical consciousness or critical social analysis, but to me, in working with young people in my practice work, this is really what you're trying to do. All key elements that I think about in oppression, the mundane particulars of ordinary lives, the way you construct and make meaning of the world, that you sometimes internalize, that allows this to exist over time. And to give you a quote, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but this is a quote from one of the people in the Movement Activist Apprenticeship Program, described in the application of the program. And I say, teachers, take heart, because you can be really agents of transformation here. Look at that. Power class, we examine systemic and historical factors related to poverty, as well as dynamics of race, gender, and class, shape the face of destitution in America. And it was a profoundly personal experience for them. So I really believe the more we create institutions to do this, and not just by talking, but demonstrating things, getting people engaged and out of their seats, the better off we'll be. So, is it Sam Madison?
Yes.
Son of a gun. All right. Madison got something to be proud of here. One of the following fathers got something right. Madison declared the concentrated wealth would destroy our nation unless the laws change. The day will come when our republic will be impossible. Now, wow, this sounds pretty radical, doesn't it? You can imagine him out there at Occupy Wall Street. Okay? Does sound a little bit familiar. So clearly, even then, and as wealthy as he was, as many slaves as he owned, he knew that this was a threat to the Union. So this is really nothing new. I guess we all know that, right? But one thing is interesting. We don't use the word oppression. I mean, looking at, well, if you're psychology, I don't know about sociology. Look in the index, see how many times that word appears. I give credit to Cornel West for some of this, but you've heard this term, under-resourced communities. They use it in NPR a lot. And I always used to think, underserved communities, what is that exactly? And so I Google it here, under-resourced communities, 688,000 results. So we pretty much understand what that is, right? Now, no social injustice comes in this term, right? Now, then I ask myself, what's the opposite of underrepresented, under-resourced communities? What would be the opposite? Over. Sounds like, how many hits do you think I hit on Google when I Google over-resourced communities? Just take a guess.
0.
Oh, you boys they're even more cynical than I am. 1.
1.
1. And guess what? It wasn't from the United States. South Africa, ZA. So I'm saying to myself, we really work hard to not really acknowledge what goes on. And this is part, when we talk about an ideology of framing notions. We talk about health disparities. In Europe, they talk about health inequalities, for example. We do a lot of things with our language to kind of, sweep things under the rug. So part of critical social analysis is surfacing some of that, but I find that remarkable. I don't know if I ever had a search where I got one return. And this is a first. And I took out the dash, and I got the same thing back. So it wasn't just word. So there's a need for this. And so that's kind of the first part I wanted to talk about. Is focus here is just, I'm going to say less about outcomes and all that, because I'm focusing now on thinking and unpacking this idea of critical social analysis. Now I want to add the identity piece to this. And so social identity, social analysis, social political development. One of the things that's interesting, how many of you are here familiar with racial identity theory, which comes out of psychology primarily? Okay, a few people are. Well, it turns out that it's very helpful in thinking about social political development with people of color, but also I think for others more broadly. It's as much a political theory as it is a theory of race. And essentially one theory by Cross says there's a pre-encounter, encounter, immersion, internalization, commitment, phases. And when I show the theory of social political development, you see some parallels. The only thing that's important here is to know that there's a period before you really begin to think critically. There's an encounter with some contradictions and some information in the world that causes you to question that. Then there's when you kind of dive in, and then ultimately you move towards internalizing this new worldview and acting on it. That's essentially what the stages are. Sellers adds two others. One is how central this identity is to who you are. That's how likely it is to affect your behavior because it's central of how you define yourself. And then whether you have positive and negative feelings about your group. And one thing that's important about social political development, how is we internalize potentially, or risk of internalizing negative beliefs around our groups to help us to understand why our group's on the bottom and other groups are on the top. Because we have to make sense of it. We see it. We have to make some sense of it. So one explanation is they deserve what they got and we deserve what we got. And we're getting less because we kind of deserve less. I may not be conscious, but if you really believe you're less, it's a lot easier to take and accept getting less. So both of these theories are important. And I'm talking about African Americans here, though, which is how they approach, how they think about these. And I'll come back to these later, but they move us into thinking, well, can a particular social analysis lead to an ideological conclusion of some sort? A lens that you regularly don to better understand how the world works above you. Because what I'm trying to get here is for a way to understand how social identities and critical social analysis relate to each other and work together to be useful in the development of activists. Okay, so the MAP study from which that quote was, and so my thinking about trying to figure out this issue of social identity, we looked at about 300 organizers who were trained from 1986 to 203. And it's a selective program, so about half get in. And about 260 of the applications were suitable studies. So these were written up things which we put on a computer and did analysis with qualitative analysis software to look at some themes, a variety of things. And so this gives you a sense of where they are. Most of them were advanced undergraduate students, some had a degree. Small percentage have no college education. It's an interesting discussion at some point we can have about how people get their political education if they don't go to college. And the vast majority of organizers who I've interviewed have, and which has been in the news, have been U.S. and college educated. Race and ethnicity are quite a diverse population there. Ages 7 to 18 average. So fairly young folks. This is just one, this is an earlier theory I used to try to understand development over time based on work by Emma Serrano Garcia, Lopez Sanchez. And you can kind of think about the theory I showed before with Cross about kind of the pre-encounter, critical, adaptive, which is somewhat different, where you just kind of don't try to change anything, you just kind of live with the system. So you know things are screwed up. But as some of the young men told me when I work with them, well, you got to do what you got to do, my brother. You know, you got to get paid. So you adapt to it. And that's sort of what people call antisocial adaptation. But I've seen another kind of adaptation too, which is folks who have talent and decide, well, I'm going to go mainstream, but they don't try to open up, you know, they find that window of opportunity to get ahead conventionally, but as they slip through it, they don't try to open it up any wider. So what happens is they go through, don't rock the boat, get what they have, get on the front of the paper, Rhodes Scholar from the projects, you know, but they actually haven't left any the institution hasn't really changed in any way to accommodate this new input, if you will. And so accommodation, adaptation is not always the one we think about with the underground economy. It can also be when we go through places and we don't do anything to widen opportunities for those who follow us. And then it's sort of similarly to cross miles as well as becomes a point when, in the pre-critical, when people encounter new information, they start reading, they start learning, and then they start really engaging in action. Now, those of you who do survey research, you often find these stage models don't work very well. They don't hold up very well often. And this, I don't think, I really saw this and see this now as useful heuristic, and it's useful in working with young people as practice. But I don't know that I would expect it to hold together, and I've not actually attempted to. I've been working more on the previous model you saw and trying to think about confirming it empirically. We can talk a little bit about that in discussion perhaps. But it's still useful for me to think about what to do when with young people and get a sense of where they are and what they need for their own social political development. So, click. So, to give you just a little taste of this, social inequalities outside of awareness, and internalized oppression can be one way of doing that. And of course, being a psychologist, I think about that can be unconscious or conscious, but it can certainly influence behavior. One example of that, as you all know, the big psychological study that had an impact on school segregation, right? The doll study. Remember that, where they presented with a black child, a white doll, and a black doll, said which is a better doll, which is a prettier doll, which is one you want to play with, and the black child consistently chose the white doll, and that was interpreted as what? What would you call that?
Internalized oppression.
That's certainly one way to think about that, right? It was really a bad research design, but that's not what we talk about. It really didn't say anything, but it had the right, well, at least in some eyes, it had the right consequences, which is challenge segregation. But that's sort of what we're talking about here as this early stage. And I'm going to give you an example of that now, and I just put this back up here so you can remember kind of what we're talking about here. It's trying to figure out where social analysis fits in this. But this is, as I recall, an Asian American woman. I was always an outsider for multiple reasons on multiple levels. I became aware of racism and sexism at a young age, but instead of fighting it, I internalized it. These are her words. Then she goes on to say, I grew up trying to ignore the fact that I was female and of Chinese heritage, again, some intersectionality there, or else resenting it when it was pointed out to me. It was only in my senior year of high school when I took a women's studies class. And she began to transform that. And you think back to that theory of cross about you have these encounters that are important in your development. You reframe and rethink the world. You read, you learn more. And then you come out in a different place. And she began to politicize her identity and use that as a resource for her understanding of the world. And again and again and again, we see a lot of pivotal and rapid political development going on in college. And again, something we can talk about a bit more, but it's beginning to fight this stuff and move forward to some of the higher stages. So there's a connection between the two. I'm not having to what time today, right? Just make sure I get it right.
We end at 5:30, but
Right.
you can.
Okay, I just checking. I'm going to give you an example of critical consciousness here. I have some sheets over there with some lyrics. Would you just pass those around if you could? It's right up in front of my computer. Yeah. Now, this is a guy I interviewed for a previous study on the making of African American activists. His name is Boots Riley. He has a group called The Kook. Lives in Oakland. Told me in his interview, which he's given me permission to say, that he sees himself, he's always seen himself as an activist first and an artist second. And I interviewed him way back in the early 90s. But then I see him turn up when I was Googling it, that he was involved in Occupy Oakland. And one of the things in working with young people, and I'll talk more, as I said, about the applied stuff later, is, now I may have to go back here to start this. I'm not sure to start and play. What you see are some lyrics, and what I would give an example of critical social analysis. And in working with young men, these are kind of videos we would give them as a counterpoint to some of the ones they're often more familiar with. Nope. Okay, let me pause for a minute here. You can come back to that if you go see. And I gave you the lyrics because you can actually, when I found out I was working with young people, that the rappers really had something constructive to say, that they should hear the lyrics better than what they're doing. Something that I understand about them. Can you see the letters? Is it moving forward here? Yeah. Now, do you know political analysis?
It's almost 10 o'clock, see I got a ball of live for property, so I slip my medium sloppily and promenade out to take up a collection. I got game like I read the directions. I'm wishing that I had an automobile as I feel the cold wind rush past. But let me stick that I'm a hustler for real, so you know I got the stolen bus pass. Just as the bus pulls up and I step to the rear, so lady look like she drank a 40 of feel. I see my old school partner say his brother got pop. Pay my respects, can you ring the bell? We came to my stop. The street light reflects off the urine on the ground, which reflects off the hamburger sign it turns round, which reflects off the chrome of the BMW, which reflects off the fact that I'm broke. Now what the hell is new? I need proof. I spot the mark walking in the tweed suit. I'm in his butt quicker than a kid from a Grease boot. Eased up slow in the street. Could tell he was suspicious by the way he slid his feet. Didn't want to muck up the cover, so I smiled with my eyes, said, hey, how's it hanging? I looked into his shoulder, but he passed with no reaction. Damn, this punk trick had hella androgens. Footsteps echo in the darkness, my teeth clenched tight like a fist in a cold sharpness. I look down and I hear my stomach growling. Step to Burger King to attack it like a trout. I never pay for things that I can get by doing dirt. Linger to the girl cashier and start to run. All up in her face and her breath was like murder. Never things I do for a free hamburger.
Well, you got my number, you gonna call me tonight?
It depends, is the burgers attached to a price? I'm just kidding, I could call even write you love letters. Thanks for the burgers, hook me up with a Dr. Pepper.
That's cool, you want some ice?
Yeah, and some fries would be hella nice.
Damn, my manager is gonna pay off, okay? Have a nice day.
I'm about to hit anyway. Fresh, dressed like a million bucks. I'll be the flyest motherfucker in the Afro in a tux. My arm is at a right angle up, silver tray in my hand. Better I interest you in some caviar? My eye shoots round the room every year, noticing the diamonds in the chandelier. Background Barry Manilow, Copacabana, and a strong damn scent of stogies from Havana. Wasn't no place where a brother might been. Snobby old ladies drinking champagne with rich white men. Alright then, let's begin this. Nights like this is good for business. 5 minutes in the mix, notice several different clicks, talking, giggling, and stripping. One big baller in between, and everybody else jacking, throttling. Found out later he on Coca-Cola bottling, talking to a black man. Who's he confused me, looking hella bougie. Video tight and sedity, recognize him as the mayor of my city who treats young black men like Frank Nitty. Mr. Coke said to Mr. Mayor, you know we got a process like ice and steel. We put up the fund for your election campaign, and wait, can you bring the champagne? Our real estate funds and opportunities arousing to make some condos out of low-income housing immediately. We need some media heat to say the games when the street, and then we bring in the police fleet, harassing me everybody till they look inebriated. When we bout to land, these black folks don't appreciate it. Don't worry about the urban league of Jesse Jackson, my man that owns Marlboro, don't it affect some? That's when I step back some to contemplate what you know. Sat down, wrestle with my thoughts like a sumo. Ain't no one player that could beat this lunacy. Ain't no hustler on the street could do a whole community. This is how deep it can get. It reads macaroni on my birth certificate. Puddin' Jang is my middle name, but I can't hang. I'm getting hustled, only knowing half the game.
Well, let's take a quick minute and see what you saw, because this is exactly what I do. I work with young men. I play one of these and sort of ask them, what do you think was going on in this video? What do you think? You sound just like they do. Deafening silence. Don't you love it when someone do this in the class? But I heard it's a good teacher supposed to count like 30 seconds and give out a chance to process on the clock. Go ahead.
Well, there's sort of a magical orientation toward what an individual can do to change the system. I mean, just magically, the people were in the right place at the right time to hear the mayor talking to the executive and all of that about campaign contributions. And indeed, the analysis was cogent as to the conditions and all of that. The possibility that one would need to do more work, more research in order to get the information one would need to change the system doesn't creep into that. It's just like, well, you know, somehow as you move through time, you'll fall into these circumstances in which you'll be able to hear this stuff. Instead of,
right. No strategy, but an analysis.
Yeah.
So the analysis was there.
Right.
Okay. And what else did you notice about it?
Well, the last line, which says he's getting hustled because he only knows half the game.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of...
So you don't really understand what's going on?
He knows what it's like to be oppressed, but now he suddenly sees with all this action going on the other side, doesn't understand that part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's disabling. It's one thing to know you're the conditions under which you live and how to navigate it. So,
Right, and it's like, first you got to kind of see something's wrong, but then like you said, then you got to figure out why it is what it is and what's behind it. And what about the women versus the men in this thing compared to what you hear about most rap music? Rap music. How are the women portrayed? The woman. Y'all don't watch much rap videos? Well, you know what you hear in the news. What do you hear mostly in the news about how women are portrayed?
I noticed that she was portrayed more positively.
She had her clothes on, didn't she?
DJ,
She had her clothes on, right?
and part of it, not just separately as an object.
And she was actually, on, like you said, she was doing the DJing on that. Okay. So one thing is that it wasn't your typical, and you can watch, I've watched a lot of them when I was doing this. This is not your typical portrayal of women in videos. How about use of the N-word? Did you pick that up anywhere? So some of this stuff is subtle for him, but to the young people really recognize this and sort of juxtaposing different videos. and looking at this analysis and talk about it as a way you can sort of engage folks around this. For us, though, it's a very interesting question is, I was thinking the other day about actually doing this. An interesting study would be trying to see if we could find ways to actually code and classify instances of critical social analysis from this kind of text data. I'm going to show you what we did with that with the data we did have, but it would be interesting to sort of see if this would be useful in such analysis. Certainly it's a wealth of data. It'd be interesting to take the top 10 rap videos in a given year and do an analysis of the content and see how much of it has political and social content and how much doesn't, right? But I think the point here is that social political analysis can be done at any age, and it has some characteristics. I mean, when you think about it, we'll talk about this later, what are the elements that make up a cogent, as some person described it, political and social analysis? And I'll get to a little bit of that before we end up, but I'm going to proceed on here. Back to thinking about the connection between social identity, social political development, critical social analysis in particular, and also intellectualism. This was an interesting quote there too, and so you see these markups according to the categories you see above. Again, we saw lots and lots, and this is kind of typical even of activists I've interviewed, talking about the role that their college experience played. Which means all of you, how many of you here teach undergraduate students? Okay. This really does speak, I think, as a potential powerful influence. Maybe your students don't come back to you and tell you all this, but certainly you can light a real fire under them and set them on the road. And I think part of why college campuses have this effect is there's a synergy between the opportunities to get involved in political action and your choices with those kinds of activities, and the options you have around what courses you take. So you can really create a synergy between the intellectual side of your interest and the action side. And again, consistent with Freir's thinking about how experience and knowledge have to really be put together for learning to occur. Now, what's interesting here when we talk about from just this analysis to an ideology, or some key elements like the need for black-led institutions and practices to focus on our collective interests. So here you see this person began to make general principles that will later guide their strategies of action. And critiques of the structural features of the institutions they were in. And internalization comes up again, and a variety of the things that suggest that political analysis, understanding the self are going on. So when we think about all young people, we should really be creating settings where all of them, and at least have the information we need to create settings where this kind of development to occur. College is a prime area for it, but we worked at the high school level, and there are many opportunities to do it at the high school level as well. And it could be a lot of, I think, interesting partnerships between universities and schools around this sort of work. So, to finish up on this, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we've been thinking about this analysis, these two parts. Here are the four things that we have pulled out of our analysis. Again, it'd be interesting to see how it works on lyrics such as this rap video you saw. One is causal attributions that cause and affect these social forces, create these sorts of outcomes. The idea that what you see in front of you in your community is actually a snapshot, but reality is like a motion picture. And you've all gone to movies like 15 minutes late, and you can't understand what the craziness going on the screen is. It's because you've missed, in effect, some history. You missed a setup of the context for what you're viewing in the moment. So when we looked at these instances from the applications, we saw the ones that we saw and looked at and thought were more political had these kind of causal attributions. And I think this is important for a number of reasons. In social psychology, there's this principle called the fundamental attribution error. And see a few heads nod. And what that means is if I see him, if I've showed a video of him, you going into Patrick, you going to the store and stealing something, and then the experiment asks Patrick, well, why do you think he stole that? Patrick is much more likely to blame that on his character than on his life circumstances or forces beyond his control. And again, consistently see in social psychology that the attribution is on the individual and not on their environment. So, and I'm shifting a little bit here to thinking about how this might look if you were either interviewing or doing surveys. The question is, well, what about social attribution? If you're walking down, let's say you're walking in a park with a 7 or 8 year old, and you see some man leaning face down, spread eagled, an empty liquor bottle a few inches from his hand, snoring loudly. And the child asks you, Mommy, Daddy, why is he laying out and sleeping in the park like that? How would you answer the child? Would you say, because he's a drunk? What kind of attribution is that, right? Personal attribution. Or would you say something like, well, he probably doesn't have a home. So many people are losing their homes out there now. So even in everyday, remember the mundane particulars of ordinary life that Gramsci talked about? It's really being able to bring this analysis to literally everyday things. Why do junk cars stay in your neighborhood 3 weeks and junk cars in my neighborhood as a professor get picked up right away? Why are there more potholes in your neighborhood in Chicago in this neighborhood and there are few potholes where I live? It's just asking young people that question. It's really interesting to hear what they say. We've asked it in so many different kinds of ways to try to figure what attribution do they attribute to the people who live there and their shortcomings and traits, going back to internalized oppression and being less than, or do they attribute it to things that are outside of their control? One interesting piece of finding that we've been trying to develop a survey measure of this. So we're starting out with the notion of person blame and system blame. So for any given social problem, you can say, like if I ask you, why is there so much drug abuse? Someone might say, the person lacks self-control. Folks who don't have discipline and self-control, they end up with a habit and they can't break it. There's a system attribution for that as well. For a lot of these, you have system and person attributions. So we started out at creating a series of items that were paired. So we'd ask them about things like, why is there a lot of trash in your neighborhood? And we'd ask, we have an A and a B version of that. They could say A, because people here, they're dirty and they don't clean up after themselves. Or C, is we don't get the services, sanitation services here that other neighborhoods get, or something to that effect. So we have a series of paired items. How we originally tried to score them is subtract one from another to get sort of a discrepancy score and look at discrepancies. That blew up, that didn't work. Then we decided to score them separately, and one thing very interesting came out of scoring them separately. Even though after we scored them separately, it ended up actually useful in predicting what we wanted to predict, but it's still an instructive exercise. What we found is, and both the student of mine who did a dissertation on this, and I also found, is that all the variance was in the social attributions. There's a lot of variance. There was very little variance in the individual attribution. So that was kind of medium to high for everybody, with very little variation. All the action was on systems. And the way of interpreting that is essentially everybody thinks that we have some control over our world. But people vary widely in terms of how much they believe that things outside social forces have an influence and institutional actions have an influence on what we do. So that was a take-home message. And at first we were kind of baffled that the individual one didn't. And that's why I think there's a problem with this notion of person blame, saying, well, that's a person blame exclamation, like, because the real issue is that unless we have a sense of agency, we can't do anything. Mount a revolution, resistance, or anything, so everybody's got to have some agency that can be applied toward their lives. So thought about that way, it kind of makes more sense to me than it did initially. But as I said, nonetheless, when we actually tried to see if either of those were related to the outcome variables of activism, didn't work out. So I'm working on another scale now. So still haven't found a scale to do that. I've had much more luck, I think, with analysis of group conversation and watching that change over time, like over 8 or 9 sessions, when presented with like the rap videos like I showed you. Had much more, I think, fortunate being able to classify this. So that was a bit of an aside, but it's important when I think about this notion of attribution, causal attribution, and emphasizing structural factors. So seeing that. Another one was historical perspective. I talked about the moving picture approach to seeing the mundane particulars of your ordinary life. Recognizing that oppression exists, or even more basic, recognize that that's not fair, but being able to articulate why it's unfair. And then finally, taking action. As someone pointed out about the video, that there was no strategy. At some point, you have to go from an understanding that there's inequality and equity, recognizing oppression and it's unjust, then you got to figure out something that will change that. But one of the things we'd like to think, though, is that if you don't have a social analysis, you're unlikely to choose and develop a structural change strategy. So you have to make some social attribution of what you see before you. Otherwise, you'll limit your work to work with individuals. So again, ways that you can cultivate this kind of analysis. So that's 4 of the themes that we saw a lot. The other one having to do with social identity. As you saw in the examples I had, frequently they wove in issues of identity with their analysis. But there's a lot of variation. Some people talked, it was very central, but all of the people in the sample were people of color. There are no whites who self-identified as white in the sample. But some had a cogent social analysis but made no mention of issues of social identity. They were probably in the minority, but so there was clearly a connection here, but it varied a good bit. What we found certainly Seller's notions of high and low centrality. So the whole thing, I guess the take-home message for me at this point is that the aim is not to tell people that you must make your social identity central to who you are to have a political analysis. But if that's central to who you are, you need to bring it through your analysis in a cogent and meaningful way. So we are thinking that what's sometimes called identity support in some literature, working with young people is important. Although I wouldn't talk about it just in terms of support, but trying to understand kind of and assess what it means to them, giving them some exposure, helping them to develop an analysis to incorporate that if that is the leading part of their identity. So I'll end with this so we can have some time to talk. The liberation stage and the 5 quote-unquote stages I talked about. E.D. Nixon, who worked fearlessly to achieve the rights of his people. One thing I like about this is it shows him channeling his anger, because when people talk about anger management, I said, well, it's not management, it's channeling. What's interesting is this emotional piece, this slow fire of discontent in the role of not just cognition in social analysis, but also emotion. Because we do find, just like that's not fair, that emotions play a powerful role in people's engagement. We find ways to channel that effectively is a very important feature of social political development. So with that, I end, and let's open it up for discussion.
I've worked in an area in which people have been concerned about the electoral process, about the voting machines and all that. And I've been warned by a number of individuals not to get too active in terms of spreading the word about the possibility that the voting machines are crooked, to use a quick and dirty expression, because that might undercut interest in the political process. If we knew some of the problems with voting machines and some of the hazards that are in our way in terms of having a straightforward electoral process, we might be less interested in voting and tune out.
Right.
So I'm wondering if there's another stage, almost past liberation, in which one needs to understand the effects of one's activities upon the broader political sphere. About bringing some issues up at some times and others at other times. I think having voting machines that work properly is at the very root of our system, the integrity of our system. But if we, again, if we spread the word too broadly, we might be in a situation where, again, people would disengage. And I'm wondering how you deal with issues along those lines.
Well, there's two things he said is important. One, the stage I didn't really talk about, Freire talks about problematizing first. You've problematized. It sounds like, well, see, you kind of shifted a little bit. Are you saying, are the machines crooked? Is that the problem, or is the problem that it appears that they're crooked?
Well, again, it's a meaty problem to encounter as to whether or not we can get the activism needed to marshal the resources to open the ballot box, basically make sure everybody has a printed, a paper ballot and all of that, make sure that the machines are working well, to make sure that this happens in every precinct where there's election, et cetera, that amount of resources so people can work on those issues, which is, of course, an issue of political awareness, as opposed to the actual technical issue of getting inside there and making sure that those votes are getting counted well. So again, there are levels of that issue, and I guess you're asking what level I can work at. And what
Well,
level
see,
we
it's
can
a
work at.
question of the problem. What usually happens is a group of people sit down and try to agree on exactly what the problem is. You've already raised three things. It's a matter of opening the machines and seeing if they were right. Is the problem that the machines are crooked, meaning they're designed to give wrong totals, or are they just unreliable? And is there any evidence about any of those? I mean, so that you've already have 5 hypotheses, all right? And so what happens, so that's just really a strategy issue. Well, it's both what the problem is. The problem is you got to problemize something and be clear and get the group to agree on that. Then you have to research the problem to get some idea, okay, really, what is it we're dealing with here? So you're not really, I think, outside of this box, but the first question is, well, the problem, and that often what takes a group the longest period of time, because people have widely different views of what the problem is and how to go after it and whether to be pragmatic or and all that kind of stuff. So that would be my answer to that particular instance. The broader question is, I think this was part of the stage of the original model I used from Irma Serrano Garcia and Andre, but it hasn't been satisfying to me over the years. It shows how you engage with oppression and you fight it, but still defining what liberation is. I've heard a lot of people say they're oppressed or from an oppressed group, but I don't hear people say I'm liberated. Okay, so it's like, well, you never really kind of get there. You get to being oppressed, but you don't get to being liberated. So what does liberation really mean? Which is a whole nother conversation. Huh?
A couple of thoughts about the very interesting things you're talking about. First, the question of getting people engaged in activism and politically conscious also applies to privileged groups. That is, a lot of student activists are not, in fact, from oppressed groups. They're white kids at Wisconsin especially, who get politicized because of moral concern. So they come here kind of with good faith and kind of open-hearted and are shocked by some things that they get taught and become activists driven not by their personal situation but by the empathy and connectedness they feel and wanting to act morally. So at Wisconsin there was, and still is, a movement around the anti-sweatshops for the university logos, which is a case of people who have absolutely no personal stake. You know, whether or not their sweatshops in Guatemala doesn't affect them directly, except at the level of their moral concerns for the kind of world they want to live in. So one question is whether, I mean, these stages are very much geared towards raising the consciousness of people who are not aware of their own oppression. The way you described it, targeted towards minorities, working class and poor. But there's also the issue of how do you raise the awareness and bring into coalition around activism and social justice issues from people who actually might benefit from the injustices of the world, and have them reject their complicity in that. And when you're teaching at a place like Wisconsin, you actually encounter more, just in the ordinary course of things, that's more the kind of student you encounter than you, I mean, there are minorities here, of course, but that's not by any means the main. So one question was just your thoughts about how you approach or think about that side of the activism.
Well, it's interesting because I had a white South African student during the period when the ANC was about to become a ruling party. She went to this research on black folks in the U.S. and said, well, you're part of the ANC, you'd be a great person to study white activists who are privileged in South Africa and figure out what makes them tick, because you're right into the thick of it. So she ended up doing that, actually. And it is different. I think the whole notion, though, is an understanding of history is critical, no matter where you place and situating yourself in history is critical. So regardless of what color you are, regardless of your background, any of these other important demographics, unless you understand the place of your group, and talk about socially salient and powerful groups, unless you understand what your position has been historically, you won't make sense of anything. So I think that's a common element. And I still find, though, history done well. Because when I've had graduate students, they, because of how in Chicago, housing segregation, they essentially had very little contact with anybody except folks like themselves. I mean, they would meet them in school, and then they would get a lot of grief from folks in school who had a very different background from them because they seemed to these folks to be so naive. And because they haven't had the life experience. So you query, well, how come you haven't had the life experience? I mean, I think you have to come at it in that way, and then actually, I mean, I think the history reading is good, but you also have to have life experience as well. So unless they go out of their way deliberately to get the life experiences that affect them here, as well as here, they're not going to make much progress. Because it's a privilege, but the whole notion of privilege is you can go where you want to go and avoid who you want to avoid most of the time. You have to consciously decide you're not going to do that anymore. That's a big thing. But even people in marginalized groups have a problem because they're going to have to end up going to dominant institutions to get jobs and everything else. So they're going to have to become, for lack of a better word, bicultural at some point. But often privileged people can avoid that. So I think the big difference is one of having the power to live your life in a way that you can duck a lot of things. And you have to decide you're going to start ducking them. There's also, if you look at Helms's work and others, a few others, they have a theory of white racial identity development. We're talking about white folks, and actually they made it sort of generic for any dominant group that talks about the stages that they move through. So there's some similar ones like pre-encounter. The thing is, though, that they often, when they figure out kind of what the bad things a group has done, they have to deal with the whole issue of guilt and what am I going to do about it, what should I do about that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some differences. But I think the history piece is one common element, and the life experience is another. Mm-hmm.
I think this leads me to ask the question of the intersection.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't read a lot of Freire, but I know that he did have some thoughts about the adverse impact on the oppressor. And I think we're facing more and more issues today where the consequences on the oppressor are becoming similar to those on the oppressed. But it's very difficult for that to be seen and acted on because of histories of mistrust and fear and so forth. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, because you've obviously thought about the oppressor as well as the oppressed. So what about the intersection? Ways to begin to bridge that, because ultimately the systems that are causing oppression are destroying all of us. But it's not understood by those who are oppressors because they're in a relatively better position. So I've said a lot there. I don't know what you want to pick out of that and respond to.
It's a question now. Well, it all comes to sort of like what dimensions we're speaking about. When you talk about damaging the oppressors, what kind of damage are you thinking of?
Okay, I think Freire may have done this, I don't know, but I think others have, that basically when you dehumanize others, when you commodify others, when you exploit others, that rebounds on the way you see the world and how you see yourself and others as well. And it rebounds on the kind of society you create. So it's not like the oppressor is escaping the consequences. I mean, I think to drive this point home, we have issues of sustainability, sustainable social and environmental systems now, and those affect everyone. And I believe that the history of the way virtually all communities of color have been treated is very closely linked to the way we're destroying the environment. So that's what I'm trying to get at that level, and that may be true on many other issues, then it seems like it's important to find ways to recognize that and then jointly try to change that. I just don't know whether that's something you.
Yeah, that's really kind of see, it's in the back that's sort of, as you say, problematizing what is a problem, a series of problems. I mean, my view is that, and as I say, when I define oppression, in order for, even though there's a great Japanese movie said this title, "The Bad Sleep Well," I mean, which really sort of this thing, you have to create a set of cognitive mechanisms to deny all things. You just said, well, they do this to people, they do that, they commodify people. But from their lived experience, that's not what's happening. I mean, so they are not understanding their behavior in that way.
Right.
People with a different life experience are analyzing them in this way.
Right.
And they have much to lose if they begin to feel badly about what they're doing.
Right.
So the question is then, one of the things that there's Mullally is a social worker who wrote a book on the social work and liberation. And he says it depends on what model you have of how the world works. He says around social justice, where most people doing social work have a conflict model. It's essentially there's people who have a certain worldview and who have more power, which is different than one that has less. And so inherently there's conflict. You're thinking about a strategy that involves reconciliation, but many activists say that there's a conflict strategy, not necessarily against individuals, but against around institutions that sort of act out power. So you still have to go back to, I think, and the whole notion of reconciliation or making peace. So that's one problem. The other problem too is like, remember King talked about, it's not the big oppressors writ large we have to worry about. It's all of us who sit by idly and do nothing, okay? Because most privileged people don't do anything actively and major themselves, but when they see something happens, they don't necessarily take action or collective action. There are examples when that didn't happen, like the stop and frisk in New York. That was very much a multiracial, multi-ethnic movement. So the whole issue is until people stop being passive and they allow things to go on and the political education occurs, we know we're not going to see any change. I don't know if that's quite a satisfying answer, but
I appreciate there's a lot of thoughts in your
Right.
response that are really helpful. So, I mean, there's no simple answer to that kind of question.
but there's also, then your question is when do you form coalitions across groups and when do you do work within groups? So there's a lot of strategy questions there, I think, too.
Just a follow-up on this. I think it's sometimes important to distinguish between how these problems work around different forms of oppression rather than treat it just as a global problem. So around gender, men have a huge amount to gain from more egalitarian and symmetrical gender relations, as well as some things which they might feel they lose. But I think it doesn't require going outside of their lived experience for many men to realize the things they lose by hypermasculinity.
So how come the men in power haven't changed anything?
Well, but there is change.
No, but I'm saying, if it's that clear, why?
No, it's not this. It's not that I'm saying it's that clear, but I think it's different from saying that the capitalist class has a lot to gain from an egalitarian economic structure. I mean, that to me is a...
Well, it's clearly clear to you, but I'm saying if it was so clear and not a matter of argument, then we would see much more rapid change, like the Equal Rights Amendment, for example. But see, don't you see though, you're reflecting this isn't just pure logic you're working with here, right?
In historical terms, the speed at which men have begun taking on nurturing roles and typically female roles is quite extraordinary. The speed at which the erosion of stereotypical male and female roles, not that it's universal, not that it's clear to everybody, but
it's very fast.
But it's very fast compared to the willingness of capitalists to give up their wealth and power. We've seen the opposite move with respect to class. It's become ever more rigid and polarized, with the boundaries more firmly in place and defended viciously. But whereas on gender, it's very much, male domination is very much on the defensive. It's eroded in the micro practices of lots of people and on historically unprecedented speed. And I think that's because there is this difference between the relationship between lived experience and interests around these different kinds of relations.
Well, this question helps me get kind of back more to the text of my talk, because, see, I don't think you can take that as though it was fact, what you just said. It'd be interesting would everybody in the room agree with what you just said. In my experience with academics, for example, a lot of people read different things different ways, so when you try to even get the agreement on what you're saying, it's happening much faster than in this other dimension. Even a statement like that, getting people to agree on, in my experience, is not easy. So one of the reasons I did this work is I found that my graduate students and I could never agree on conclusions such as the one you just made. The only thing we could agree on is how to a quality process of moving towards solutions, the process, not the outcome. And I think critical consciousness is not about drawing a particular conclusion, because in groups doing work collectively, you don't typically all get on the same page. And once you start talking about facts in the social world, you usually get into problems. So my argument, I would say, in dialogue with you, is that I've gotten to be very non-ideologically, personally, and much more concerned with the quality of the process of getting your conclusions than what you conclude. Because that is the essence of a movement, that people have to respect different views and try to find some common ground that's not actually agreement that they can work towards. So that's the thing, because you see what I'm saying, though, that the process versus the outcome, and that I think critical social analysis is much more about quality process than particular outcome. Which means we might end up with some conservatives who end up with a very different view than we do. Not to malign any conservatives maybe out here in the audience today.
Are we out of time?
Nope, I'm just looking at it.
So if we're looking at processes of liberation and critical consciousness, what are some of the hallmarks of a quality process? Are they experiences? Are they cognitive forms of engagement or emotional ones? Are they something to do with a setting that has some particular features to it or opportunities that exist? What are some of the things, either in practice or in your data, that you've seen that are common hallmarks of quality?
Both in practice and in data, a safe environment, an intellectually safe environment is important. Because we found with a lot of young folks that they jump on each other and say, well, stupid man, why do you say that? And so in terms of taking intellectual risk, we'd have to go a few sessions before people were comfortable taking intellectual risks. So that's a key thing. Now also the notion is we're interested in exploring ideas, not agreeing on everything. So we would focus on a quality process of analysis, but not necessarily agreeing on the same thing. So you have to be able to actually make a case for what you're saying, but you don't have to. But the final outcome, people may not agree. So those are important ones. And then I could go in, and probably next time I'll talk a little bit more about practice. There are very specific things we did to make that happen, but that was one. One of the things I found everywhere working with young people, and all the practitioners I've worked with young people say, that one thing that's critically important is respecting each other. I mean, above all. In fact, I can't emphasize that one word enough in urban neighborhoods I've worked with. You have to get folks to respect each other and understand deeply what that means and what that looks like. So that's it. I think another concept out of education, critical thinking, is very similar to critical consciousness. In fact, I guess you could say, marketed the work we do with young men as a critical thinking intervention, where we would teach them how to think critically about ideas. Not to conclude the same thing, but to think critically about ideas. So if you look at sort of the critical thinking literature and the dimensions of that, I think they're parallel, the same kinds of things that I associate with that. Really, I think critical social analysis is just a special case of critical thinking that applies it to political and social subject matter.
I'm wondering if you've noticed any like age group differences between what helps move people from the analysis, the critical consciousness piece to action. You know, when you were working with the high school students or the older organizers, or maybe some of the older folks in your earlier interviews.
Right. Well, one thing in the study I'm doing now, the international study, you've been asking what would seem to be a simple question, but for us academics, something simple, which is, what does age matter in terms of the number of times the Earth went around the sun, which admittedly is rather arbitrary, isn't it? I would say that what really matters is how much experiences you've had in the work. So we talk about our members as either novices or veterans. But obviously age is correlated with experience. So the more experienced people will tend to be the older ones. But unless you're talking about sort of when people can do, the point at which young people can do abstract thinking and that kind of thing, there's a cut there. But there's so much variation from young person to their age in terms of when they can do that, that I found that age, in the groups we work with, there's a lot of gray area on either side. It doesn't tell you as much as roles they've played in previous action, how much experience they've had, and who they've been talking to. Because it's the best, consistently in the literature, the best predictor of a young person's involvement in politics is their parents or whoever raised them is involved in politics. Every single study, that's always the one thing. So really the benchmark for any, quantitative studies, can you beat the variance accounted for by parents? Because that's really the thing to do. So what means if a kid comes in with a heavy duty dose, they're going to all these rallies with their parents. Boots had a very political family, for example. They're going to come in much more advanced than young people who haven't had that kind of analysis. They would tell me how they're sitting down with their parents watching TV, and the parent would say, see the mayor saying all that stuff about what he's doing for that neighborhood? He's not doing anything. You know that thing up there he said he was going to fix that? Remember we said, he didn't fix that. You know why he didn't fix it? Because he put the money over in that neighborhood. So this kid's getting this running commentary from parents, the analysis of everything the mayor is saying, for years before they even join this group. So even though they may be younger, and that's the beauty and power of a group, which is the young people, the experienced folks can really help the rest of the group grow. And so as an adult, you kind of sit back and let the group, and the empowerment of people becoming teachers and not just learners is the whole reason by when you're doing work around liberation, the group has got to have the power, not the leader standing up there. The group has got to have the power. Great questions.
What do you encounter a group where there's none of those potential leaders or teachers within the group, in which everybody's basically naive, and does that pose a different challenge?
Never a group with no resources. Actually, I find that issues are often more which you have to struggle with than the groups. I mean, there are certain things that young people have not been exposed to, and if you bring the topic up, it becomes a problem. Whereas any other topic, they have plenty of resources and life experiences to bring to it. So no, I've never. All the groups, it's amazing. I mean, and I think about that because the only time our group really ever got completely stumped had to do with male-female relationships. It was dramatic how much it got stumped on. We showed a video and it kind of blew up in our faces. And we thought it was so extreme that at least it had to be one person who wouldn't agree with what they just saw, but they all did. So, but that hadn't happened with any other topic. So I think certain topics are more difficult to understand. Did you have something you're going to ask?
Well, yeah, my concept of the oppressed versus the oppressor. I go back to the movie Titanic.
Mm-hmm.
And on the upper deck, you have these boring upper elite people. And below decks, you have these Englishmen, if you will, the elites. And below decks, you have this rousing party of the Irishmen, the lower class people, just having a great time. And the philosopher of 2,000 years ago, the way I interpret the problem with the rich is they are self-contained and cut themselves off from the glory of the individuality and enjoyment that each and every individual can give you. Like if that philosopher of 2,000 years ago was seeing the sick and the imprisoned and raising the dead and curing people and things like that, he was in touch with humanity in a very unique and special way. And he always had parties, he always had dinners and stuff like that. He was a party animal in a way. It's a strange way of looking at him, but I think there's a lot of evidence for that. And I think that's where the rich man cuts himself off. And if the economists have figured that $72,000, up to that level, you increase your happiness. Above that level, no net increase.
Right.
At that point, your possessions possess you, become burdens on you. You get this narrow attitude about other people, and that's your own prison, your own hell, if you will, that you entrap yourself in. So that's how I conceptualize.
I agree with you completely. I mean, I think it reinforces the idea that real power is be able to define in the world what's important and what's not. And because even if your analysis says that they're the ones who got the hang-ups, the handicaps, or the dull life, the rest of us have that. But somehow everybody's still chasing, or many people are chasing the same thing. How is it that the script could be flipped it like that and so many people would buy into it? I mean, so what was the power that even allowed that to happen? Because I agree with you completely in what you're saying. But there's some way in which culture functions and power functions, which constructs what the good life is.
Well, they're internalizing their own elite role.
Well, but they are elite, right? I mean, well, the fact that you're calling them elite suggests that. You see what I'm saying? I mean, we've created these constructions, and it takes power to create them. And we also have the internalizer. We internalize stuff, and we believe it in some. It's like the emperor has no clothes, right? Essentially. And I think they're naked. So.
Can you sell or teach critical social analysis to privileged people?
Well, a lot of them have it, I think. I think that's why it reinforces the need to do that. I think in the U.S. it can be particularly difficult because even when you look at descendants of Europeans who are in the U.S. and the dominant culture here, even compared to Europeans see things much more in systems terms and group terms than individualism, the rugged individualism of the Marlboro Man and conquering the West, and this whole notion that the individual, the rugged individual, can make whatever the self-made man image is really a very U.S. thing. So getting people collectively to work on things, I think, is more of a challenge here. But absolutely, I believe, and I think you had said, this dichotomy about the oppressor and oppressee, if you will. I don't really believe that's not real. Those are ideas, because when you're doing political work, you typically choose a target. And a target is someone who has the power to make a change that you think will make your life better in some way. And you can't ever make your life better in some way if there's something that's beyond your direct control that's in the way of that. So you have to figure out the target who can make the change. And that becomes the person who you oppose. Okay? And the idea is that represents a form of oppression and injustice. But just because we say it is doesn't mean it is. So we still need to think critically, right? But those are really, I think, useful mental devices. But if you start reifying them and essentializing them and taking them too seriously, you're going to get into trouble. But you do need a target if you want to change something. Even if you don't like the sheets on your bed, you got to know that there's something better, and you got to you always have to find out what the problem is and get a solution for it. So target is how we work.
So it's 5:30.
Okay.
A little after 5:30. And
thanks so much, folks, for sticking around.